Well, good morning or good afternoon, whenever you happen to be watching this or listening to this, whether you're sitting at your home, around your TV or your computer screen watching this as a family, or as you do, if you do as I do, so many times I put my headphones in and I put on a podcast and I go for a walk or a jog. Regardless of how you are participating in this podcast or vodcast, I just want to say thank you for watching, for tuning in. We are meeting face to digital face yet again, and we are working as a church on when we can come back together safely to make sure that we are all practicing social distancing and smart health guidelines. And so just know that is in the works. But in the meantime, we are kind of doing this thing digitally, one with another. This morning, I want to kind of do a different exercise with you. I want to kind of think through some things with me. We're going to play a word association game. I'm going to say a word, and I just want you to think what comes into your mind. An image, a picture, a word, a phrase. But just as I say these words or these names, I just want you to have an image of this in your mind, okay? Here's your first word. Ready? Giraffe. All right, wrong, right, short, tall, doesn't matter. What do you think of when you think of the word giraffe? All right, here's another one for you. Ready? Tyrannosaurus Rex. Okay, you got it? All right, how about this one? We're in East Nashville. All right, so I'm going to kind of throw this one out there. Brown recluse. Right, those are very sometimes charged words. How about this? Ready? How about the name Donald? Or, okay, how about Joe? Right, all of these names that we have, all these words, they kind of bring with them a picture or a feeling or an emotion. And there's certain reasons that we use certain names to describe something or someone, or maybe even as I was talking with a friend of mine the other day who they're getting ready to have their second child, and we were talking about baby names. And I said, not every name can be used when naming your child. There is a certain reason that Kelly, my wife, and I used the names for our kids and didn't use other names. There was no way on the earth that we were ever going to name our son Chad. Now, if your name is Chad, I'm sure you're a lovely human being, and I'm grateful for you. But just that was not going to be a name that we used for our children, because with it comes a lot of baggage. There were other names that we chose to not use because of the connotations or the meanings that they have with them. But now here's a word I want you to think about. And here's a name I want to give you, and I want you to kind of wrap your mind around this. What about the name or the word God? What comes to your mind when you think about God, that word or that phrase or that name, God, G-O-D? One of the most overlooked things that we have in our spiritual lives is the fact that the word God is actually not a name. It's a title. And when you look at the scriptures, especially when you start from the beginning, what you see is that God actually has a name he wants to be called. He actually has a conversation, which we will look at in a few moments, where he says, I want you to call me this from now on. This is how I want people to know me. And here's the secret. It's not God. It's actually something completely different. But to get there, I want to kind of set this up for you. So I'm going to actually little nerd out on you for a minute, okay? If you can hang with me for about 10 minutes, I promise you I will make this worth it. So do you ever think about why do we call God God? I mean, it seems like a very generic type of word used to describe this sort of otherworldly being. Why would we use the word God? Well, if you actually go back to the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures and the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says there that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the word God that's used there is actually the word Elohim. Now, if you fast forward through the next several chapters, we see that this Elohim was creating everything that we see, everything that we know, both visible and invisible, everything that exists in our present reality now, called the world and the universe and the galaxy. It all exists created by this Elohim. Now, for years and for centuries, this Elohim would have this kind of very transcendent relationship with humanity. We see that the Elohim spoke to Adam and Eve and had this relationship with them before they left the garden. Later on, the Elohim is having a conversation with a guy named Noah, and he said that I'm going to destroy the world, but I'm going to save you, and so I want you and your family and all these animals to get in a boat, and the Elohim had this conversation with Noah. Then we fast forward a few hundred years after that, and we come to a guy named Abram. Now, up until this point, Elohim has kind of been this off, sort of distant, transcendent, otherworldly being that we couldn't really wrap our mind around. And in this Genesis chapter 17, which is where we're going to pick up real quick, we see that this Elohim actually has a conversation with a guy named Abram. And Elohim had showed up to Abram, and he says, Abram, I'm going to make you a promise. I'm going to make you the father of many, many nations. Now, the issue is that at this point, at the age of 99, Abram had not had any children. So you see where that's kind of problematic, because you can't be the father of many nations if you don't even have one kid. So here's what happens is that Elohim shows up and he has this conversation with Abram in Genesis chapter 17, and it sounds like this, verse 1. Now, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Now, here's what is interesting about these verses, is that it says that God Almighty showed up and had this conversation with Abram. He says, this is how I want you to call me. Call me God Almighty, which is not Elohim, but El Shaddai. You see, in Abram's culture, the Canaanite culture, they were a polytheistic culture, meaning that they had thousands of gods. They had a god for everything, a sun god, a moon god, a fertility god, a harvest god. They had a god for everything under the sun, literally. But there was one God that was kind of the king of all those gods. He was the creator God. And so when Elohim shows up to have this conversation with Abram, here's what he says. He says, I want you to know, Abram, that I am the El Shaddai. I am the God of all gods. I am the God Almighty. And then he does three things with him. The first thing is this. He promises him that he's going to give him a son. Look down in verse 3. It says, Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Abram, I am making a covenant, I'm making a promise with you, and you are going to be a father of many, many children. So the first thing that happens is that Abram was going to have a son. The second thing that God does is he makes a promise to him, a covenant with him. That he's going to not just be a father of one kid, but of multitudes, of literally hundreds and thousands of people. And then to prove it, he does this. Look in verse 5. It says, No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. See, Abram means dad or father, but Abraham means father of nations. Verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I'll make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generation for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings and the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So here's what God is saying here is not only I'm going to make you a father of a multitude of nations, but I'm making a promise to you. I'm making a covenant with you, Abram. Which leads us into the third thing. The third thing is I will be with you. I will be your El Shaddai, not just this generic kind of nebulous, off netherworldly sort of being, but I'm going to be your personal God Almighty. And to prove it, I'm going to give you the land that you've been wandering through right now, the land of Canaan. Now we see that God does indeed keep his promise. For several years and several generations, Abraham has multiple children over and over again. He actually ends up having lots of kids, and these kids have kids, and their kids have kids, and so on and so forth, until it grows into this huge nation called Israel. Now, Israel was living in Egypt at the time, and they got to be so big and so numerous that Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt, began to get really worried and insecure. He was thinking that, man, if Israel began to see and recognize the amount of power they have because of the number of people that they have, then they could overthrow the Egyptian regime, and Pharaoh would have a problem on his hands. So he did what he knew to do, and the only thing he could think of doing in that moment, he's like, I'm going to put them into slavery. So that's why for several years, for 400 years actually, the Israelites served the Egyptians as slaves. Now the problem with that is this. At this moment, Israel is not in the land of Canaan anymore. They're actually in Egypt. So God had kept his promise to Abraham in making him the father of a multitude of nations, but they're stuck in Egypt. They've got to get back to Canaan. Now, fast forward with me several hundred years and a few chapters to the right. We're going to go to Exodus chapter 3. Now, in this moment, a guy named Moses kind of came onto the scene. And Moses was a Jew that through some miraculous circumstances wound up being raised in Pharaoh's house. Now, one day Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave, and so he takes matters in his own hands and he kills the Egyptian and then runs away, fleeing for his life. For a number of years, I think like 40 years, he becomes a shepherd, and he marries this priest out in the middle of nowhere in a land called Midian. And he becomes a shepherd, and he's kind of guiding the sheep through this kind of wilderness, barren land. And one day he comes across this really strange thing in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says this: Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, but it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, and why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, yeah, here I am. Then God said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So just pause here for a moment. Moses tending his sheep, doing his daily routine of shepherding this flock, sees this bush that's on fire, and a voice is coming out of the bush. And Moses is like, I need to go check that out. He walks over there, and the voice says, Moses. And Moses is like, yes? And God says, I am El Ohim. I am the El Shaddai of Abraham, the El Shaddai of Isaac, and the El Shaddai of Jacob. I am that God that made that covenant promise years ago to Abraham. And I'm now having a conversation with you. Verse 7. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, right? This is God saying, hey, I remember my promise that I had with Abraham. And not only was I going to make him the father of a multitude of nations, but I was going to bring him back to Canaan. And guess what, Moses? The time has come, and the time is now. Skip down to verse 10. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel up out of Egypt? And he said, but I will be with you. And this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Now here's where it gets crazy. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I send to him? What shall I say to them? Now, that question that Moses asks there, if they say, what is his name? It's a weird kind of translation that happens in our English Bible from the original Hebrew. Now, I don't know if you took a foreign language in high school, maybe Spanish or French or German, but there are a lot of times that we learn phrases or hear phrases in another language that don't seem to have a direct correlation in English, or at least they don't seem to make sense in English. Here's an example. My family and I lived in Turkey for a number of years. And when you were in Turkey, you were sort of the sign of being a good host is serving tea or chai to the person who is sitting across from you. Now, if you got a glass of tea and it was the perfect consistency, the perfect temperature, and the perfect amount of sugar and sweetness in there, you would say, Tav Shan Kana. Doesn't that just sound poetic? Tav Shan Kana. Now, the problem is that when you translate Tav Shan Kana into English, it literally means rabbit's blood. Now, how's that for a mental image, right? Like, oh, man, this sweet tea is so amazing. It's like rabbit's blood. Like, try that at your next family gathering and see how well that goes. Like, it's just weird, right? But in Turkish, it makes sense. Well, that's the same thing that's happening right here in the Hebrew language, which is what the Old Testament is written in. Moses says to God, what shall I tell them your name is? But that's not actually what Moses said in the original language. In the original language, Moses says this. What is the meaning of your name? Like, God, like, I know, like, we know a little bit about you being the El Shaddai of Abraham, but what does your name actually mean? And look at God's response there. Verse 14. And so God says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to this to people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Now, there's something else happening here in the Hebrew language. If you just kind of hang with me just for a few moments, that you really need to kind of see this, what's going on here. Moses asks God, tell me, like, what is the meaning of your name? And Elohim, God, responds, I am who I am. Now, what's really happening in the Hebrew here is that the phrase that God is using is Eyach Asher Eyach. And that word Eyach, literally, it's what that first person singular, where we would say I am, comes from the Hebrew word to be, which is Hayah. Like, think like Taekwondo, Karate Kid, like Hayah, right? It's the same kind of, pronunciation, even though the meaning is completely different. And it's the word to be. And the way that the phrase works out here when God is having this conversation with Moses is he says this, tell them I am what I will be is sending you. And then he kind of flips it around and says, well, there's another way of saying this, Moses. Tell them that my name is, and then he uses the third person singular. Rather than saying Eyach, that first person I am, he actually uses the third person singular, which is represented by the four letters YHWH. What we would say is Yahweh. I am who I am. Or Moses, you tell them, third person singular, he is who he will be, Yahweh. Tell them Yahweh sent you. Now, if you look at your English translation, what does it have there? It doesn't have Yahweh. It doesn't say, tell them, Moses, that he is sent you. It actually is represented by 4 other letters, L-O-R-D, most of the time in capital letters. It's the word Lord in all caps. Now, how did we get from Yahweh to Lord? Well, there's a couple of things happening here that we need to see. The first is this. In the Hebrew language, when it's written down, there are no vowels, right? It's all consonants. We actually do this a lot too in our current English language. When you're texting somebody in like a form of shorthand, like instead of saying be right back, you say BRB. Now, if you're just reading that and you don't really know what that means, you're like, burb? Like, what is burb? Right? Or here's another one, TTYL. Talk to you later. Right? Or C or SYS. See you soon. Right? It's kind of a shorthand. And that's what the Hebrew scholars used to do. Because when you're having to make your own paper by hand, you want to save as much space as possible. So they would only use the consonants. Now, this wasn't a problem, because what they would do is whenever they would stand up to read the text, they knew what the words meant. So you get to a word like Elohim, and you're like, oh, I know Elohim. Like, I know what that means. Now, a few hundred years before Jesus was born, the Hebrew scholars valued and respected and held the name Yahweh in such regard that they stopped saying Yahweh's name whenever they would come to it. So whenever they would see those 4 letters together, Y-H-W-H, whenever they would see those together, they wouldn't say Yahweh. They actually substituted another word, Adonai, which means, you guessed it, the Lord. Now, there's kind of a problem with this. Because when you think about the word Lord, we understand that Lord is not a name, it's a title. And what does God tell Moses? What does Yahweh tell Moses? He says, I don't want to be known as a title. Like, I'm not God anymore. My name is Yahweh. And here's why this matters. When I'm on a date with my wife, and I'm looking at her across the table, and there's music, and the food is wonderful, and it's this incredibly intimate moment. And I look at her. If I were to say to her, I love you so much, the wife. The wife, you mean everything to me. I'm so glad you are the mother of my children, the wife, and I cannot wait to spend the rest of my life with you, the wife. That just is weird. Like, nobody talks like that. Why? Because even though Kelly is my wife is sort of her title. That's not her name. And when we read the scriptures, and when we understand what's happening in these moments, we recognize that what God is saying is this: I'm not just a title of a far removed, far off, like transcendent, otherworldly being. I want to be known, and I have a name. You see, names are words of intimacy. When I'm with my wife, I say, Kelly, I love you. Kelly, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Kelly, I am so glad that you are the mother to my children because you are wonderful. And Kelly, I love you. And that's what God is getting at here. He's saying, I want to be known as Yahweh. That will be my name forevermore. Now, you immediately see another problem jump off the page. Does God answer Moses' question? Remember, Moses' question was this: tell me, describe to me who it is that sent me. Who is it that's sending me? Not just your name, but like describe yourself to me. And God's response, Yahweh's response is, tell them he is who he will be. Now that sounds very poetic and very lovely, but that doesn't really answer Moses' question. But we see later on that Moses indeed has a conversation with Pharaoh, and through many trials and many just heartaches, Pharaoh ends up letting the Israelites go. Now, they finally get out of Egypt, And they come into this wilderness, and they're on the precipice. They're getting ready to go into Canaan. And we get to Exodus chapter 33, and Moses is again having a conversation with Yahweh. And the conversation goes something like this. God, Yahweh, like, we're not going to go into the land unless you come with us. And Yahweh says, okay, I'm going to go with you. Like, I get that. Like, yes, we're in this together. And then Moses kind of has the audacity, and he just kind of like comes to the table and he says, I want to ask you for something that may be impossible. This is where we pick up in Exodus 33, verse 18. It says this, Moses said to Yahweh, please show me your glory. Show me your glory. Now, the word glory there is a word in the English language that we often think of like fame or recognition. Like you think of something going viral or somebody becoming insta-famous or like being a social media influencer. Like when they walk into a room, you see them and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so-and-so. Like, I can't believe it, right? Or you're following them. You're like, that's amazing, right? But in the Hebrew language, the word glory actually comes from the word chabod, which means not fame or recognition, but it means presence and beauty. And so what Moses is telling Yahweh is this, Yahweh, like I know you by name, but I want to know you by your presence. I want to see your beauty. And look at what God's response is in verse 19. He said, I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But verse 20, he said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. Basically what God says is this, Moses, I'm actually going to go back and answer the question you asked me a few chapters ago in Exodus chapter 3. Right? When you said, like, what does your name mean? I'm going to do that for you, but you cannot see my beauty because it is so marvelous. It is so wonderful that just looking at the pureness of my beauty will kill you. So I'm going to answer the question you asked me a few moments ago, or really actually several years prior, when you asked me, what is your name, or what does your name mean? And I'm going to reveal something to you. So Moses, get ready. So the next day in Exodus chapter 34, we see that Moses gets ready. He gets the tablets that we would later know as the Ten Commandments. He gets them ready. He cuts them out and he brings them onto the mountain. And it says this in Exodus 34, verse 4. It says, so Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the first. And he arose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him. And he took in his hands 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name Yahweh. And Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquities and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. See, what God does here is God finally answers that question that Moses had. When he says, God, Yahweh, tell me what is the meaning of your name? And God says, okay, wait here and watch. And Yahweh passes in front of Moses and he says, I am who I will be, which means this, what I'm getting ready to tell you, I will be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. That concept of I am who I will be, which means I will never change. I will never stop being what I am. And Moses, here is what I am. Do you see how he described himself? He says, I am merciful. I am and will be continuously 24/7 gracious. I am and will be 24/7 slow to anger. 24/7 abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And I am and will keep steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Now, I am generally a nice guy. At least I like to think of myself as a nice guy. Right? I'm pretty happy-go-lucky. Right? I don't meet a stranger. I love to connect with people. I love hanging out. I love laughing. I love all of those things. I'm genuinely, most of the time, a nice guy. But if I'm hungry, I tend to not be as nice. Right? If I haven't slept very well, right? Or if I haven't gotten enough me time or alone time, I tend to be grumpy. Chances are you're probably a wonderful person most of the time. But none of us can say that with consistency, 100% of the time, every day of the year, 24/7, we are nice, compassionate, loving, and great human beings. Why? Because reality sets in and we just aren't those things. But look at what Yahweh says. My name, I am who I will be. Yahweh, He is always and forever, continuously, 100% of the time, never wavering, unfettered, just 100% gracious, slow to anger, merciful, forgiving, and lovely. You see, this is the way God wants us to know Him. Not as God, a title, Lord, that's far removed and distant from us, but as Yahweh. As Yahweh. Richard Rohr, he says, the people who know God well, those who risk everything to find God, always meet a lover, not a tyrant. So go back to that exercise that we had at the beginning of this and think about that for a moment. When you think about Yahweh, what comes to your mind? Here's an exercise I want you to do with me. Okay, in a few moments we're going to pray. And when we do, we are going to pray to Yahweh. And at some point over the course of this day or this week, whenever you're praying, I just want you to sit for a moment in silence and just say that, Yahweh. Yahweh. He is who He will be. Gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving sin and iniquity and transgression. Yahweh, He is. And so now, Yahweh, we thank You that You are not far off. You are not simply one of a plurality of gods that we have to fight through to just get to listen to us. But You are Yahweh, the El Shaddai of Abraham, the Elohim for Moses, and the Yahweh of anyone who calls out to You. May we feel Your presence and Your closeness today, tomorrow, and the next day. And when we begin to feel alone and isolated, may the name Yahweh come to mind. Amen. Well, hope. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you His peace. You are sent.